The kingdom of Valoria was once a land of prosperity and peace, its golden spires gleaming under the sun and its people thriving under the wise rule of King Alden. But that was before the darkness came. The shadow sorcerer Malvora, a figure of legend whispered about in hushed tones, had emerged from the forgotten corners of the world, bringing with him an army of shadow creatures that consumed everything in their path. The kingdom's armies fought valiantly, but they were no match for the sorcerer's dark magic. One by one, the cities fell, until only the capital remained. Princess Elara stood on the balcony of the royal palace, her heart heavy as she watched the city burn. The screams of her people echoed through the night, mingling with the roars of the shadow creatures that prowled the streets below. She clutched the railing tightly, her knuckles white, as tears streamed down her face. Her father, King Alden, and her brother, Prince Cedric, were leading the defense, but even they could not hold back the tide of darkness. Elara felt a deep sense of helplessness. She had spent her life studying history and diplomacy, believing that peace could be achieved through words rather than swords. But now, as the castle gates crumbled under the weight of the enemy's assault, she realized how naive she had been. "Your Highness, we must go." The voice of General Kale, her father's most trusted commander, broke through her thoughts. He was a towering figure, his armor battered and bloodied from the battle, but his eyes were steady and determined. "The castle will fall soon. If we do not leave now, all will be lost." Elara turned to him, her voice trembling. "I cannot leave my people, Kale. They need me." "Your people need you alive," Kale replied firmly. "You are the last hope of Valoria. If you fall, the kingdom falls with you." Reluctantly, Elara nodded. She followed Kale through the winding corridors of the palace, the sounds of battle growing louder with each passing moment. They reached a hidden passage beneath the castle, where a small group of soldiers awaited them. Without a word, they descended into the darkness, leaving behind the only home Elara had ever known. The journey through the tunnels was long and arduous. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the only light came from the flickering torches carried by the soldiers. Elara's mind raced with thoughts of her family and her people. She wondered if her father and brother were still alive, if they had managed to hold the line. She wondered if there was any hope left for Valoria. When they finally emerged on the outskirts of the city, they were met with a scene of devastation. The countryside was overrun with shadow creatures, their glowing red eyes piercing the darkness. The group was forced to fight their way through, and Elara witnessed the bravery of her soldiers as they sacrificed themselves to protect her. One by one, they fell, until only Elara and Kale remained. Exhausted and wounded, they took refuge in an abandoned farmhouse. Kale tended to his injuries while Elara sat by the window, staring out at the desolate landscape. She felt utterly alone, the weight of her guilt and grief pressing down on her like a physical force. Kale approached her, his voice gentle but firm. "We will find allies," he said. "We will rebuild. But first, we must survive." That night, Elara had a vivid dream. She saw a glowing light in the distance, calling to her. When she woke, she told Kale about the dream, and he recognized it as a sign of the Light of Eloria, an ancient artifact said to have the power to banish darkness. Kale suggested they travel to the neighboring kingdom of Lyrian, where they might find information about the artifact. As they continued their journey, Elara and Kale were ambushed by a group of shadow creatures. Kale fought valiantly, but he was overwhelmed. In a desperate attempt to save Elara, he told her to run while he held off the creatures. Reluctantly, Elara obeyed, fleeing into the forest. She ran until she could run no further, collapsing in a clearing. When she woke, she found herself in a dark cell, surrounded by the eerie glow of Malvora's fortress. She was not alone, a voice from the cell next to hers spoke. "You're not the first to end up here," the man said. "But if you're willing to trust me, we might just get out alive." The cell was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mildew and despair. Princess Elara sat on the rough stone floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to steady her breathing. The events of the past few days played over and over in her mind, the fall of her kingdom, the loss of her family, the desperate escape, and now this. She was a prisoner in the fortress of Malvora, the very man who had destroyed everything she loved. The voice from the neighboring cell broke through her thoughts. "You're not the first to end up here," the man said, his tone calm but laced with bitterness. "But if you're willing to trust me, we might just get out alive." Elara turned toward the sound, squinting through the dim light. She could barely make out the silhouette of a man sitting against the bars of his cell. His face was shadowed, but his voice carried a hint of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Name's Liran," he replied. "Former soldier of Lyrian, current prisoner of Malvora." "And you?" "Elara," she said, hesitating for a moment before adding, "of Valoria." Liran let out a low whistle. "Valoria, huh? I heard what happened. I'm sorry." Elara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. "You said we might get out of here. How?" Liran leaned closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been here for months. I've learned a thing or two about this place. Malvora's fortress is a maze, but there's a way out. Problem is, it's guarded by his shadow creatures and a few traps. Alone, neither of us stands a chance. But together? We might just make it." Elara studied him, trying to gauge his trustworthiness. She had no reason to believe him, but what other choice did she have? "Why should I trust you?" she asked. Liran chuckled dryly. "You don't have to trust me. But if you want to live, you don't have much of a choice." Elara sighed, nodding reluctantly. "All right. What's the plan?" Over the next few hours, Liran laid out his plan. He explained that the fortress was built around a central tower, where Malvora conducted his dark rituals. The cells were located in the lower levels, and the only way out was through a series of tunnels that led to the surface. However, the tunnels were heavily guarded, and the path was fraught with traps designed to kill or capture anyone foolish enough to attempt an escape. "There's one thing Malvora didn't account for," Liran said, a sly grin spreading across his face. "The guards are predictable. They follow the same patrol routes every night. If we time it right, we can slip past them." Elara listened intently, her mind racing. She had no combat training, and the thought of facing Malvora's creatures filled her with dread. But she knew she couldn't stay here. If there was even a sliver of a chance to escape, she had to take it. "What about the traps?" she asked. "I've memorized their locations," Liran replied. "As long as you stick close to me, you'll be fine." Elara nodded, her resolve hardening. "All right. Let's do this." The escape began that night. Liran had managed to pick the lock on his cell using a piece of metal he had hidden in his boot. He quickly moved to Elara's cell, working on the lock with practiced ease. Within minutes, the door creaked open, and Elara stepped out, her heart pounding. The two moved silently through the dimly lit corridors, sticking to the shadows. Liran led the way, his movements confident and precise. They encountered their first guard at a crossroads, a hulking shadow creature with glowing red eyes. Liran motioned for Elara to stay back as he crept up behind the creature, dispatching it with a quick, silent strike. Elara watched in awe, realizing just how skilled Liran was. As they continued, Liran pointed out the traps, pressure plates hidden in the floor, tripwires strung across the walls, and magical wards that would alert the guards if triggered. Elara followed his instructions carefully, her nerves on edge with every step. They reached the tunnels without incident, but their luck ran out when they encountered a patrol of shadow creatures. Liran fought valiantly, taking down two of the creatures before they could raise the alarm. But the third creature managed to land a blow, sending Liran crashing to the ground. Elara acted on instinct. She grabbed a fallen torch and swung it at the creature, the flames catching on its shadowy form. The creature let out an unearthly screech before disintegrating into smoke. Liran looked up at her, a mixture of surprise and admiration in his eyes. "Not bad for a princess," he said, wincing as he got to his feet. Elara helped him up, her hands trembling. "We need to keep moving." The rest of the journey was a blur. They navigated the tunnels, avoiding traps and guards, until they finally reached the surface. The fresh air hit Elara like a wave, and she took a moment to breathe, her legs shaking with exhaustion. But their relief was short-lived. As they emerged from the tunnels, they found themselves face to face with Malvora himself. The sorcerer stood tall and imposing, his dark robes billowing in the wind. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light as he regarded them with a cold, calculating gaze. "Princess Elara," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I must admit, I'm impressed. Few have made it this far." Elara's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "You won't win, Malvora. Your darkness will not last." Malvora chuckled, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "We shall see." Before he could act, Liran stepped forward, drawing a hidden dagger from his sleeve. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice steady. Malvora's smile faded, replaced by a look of pure malice. "Very well." The two clashed, Liran's dagger against Malvora's dark magic. Elara watched in horror as Liran was thrown to the ground, his body writhing in pain. Malvora turned to her, his hand outstretched, ready to strike. But then something inside Elara snapped. She felt a surge of energy, a warmth spreading through her body. Her hands began to glow with a soft, golden light. Malvora hesitated, his expression shifting to one of surprise. Elara didn't understand what was happening, but she didn't need to. She raised her hands, and the light burst forth, driving Malvora back. The sorcerer let out a roar of anger before vanishing into the shadows. Elara collapsed to her knees, the light fading. Liran crawled over to her, his face pale but determined. "We need to go," he said. "Now." The two stumbled away from the fortress, their bodies battered but their spirits unbroken. As they put distance between themselves and Malvora's stronghold, Elara couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. She didn't know what the light within her meant, but she knew one thing for certain: she was no longer the helpless princess she had once been. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls, but Princess Elara barely noticed. Her mind was still reeling from the events at Malvora's fortress. The light that had burst from her hands, what was it? And why had it driven Malvora back? She glanced at Liran, who was walking beside her, his steps slow and deliberate. He was still recovering from his injuries, but he refused to rest for long. "You're quiet," Liran said, breaking the silence. "Still thinking about what happened back there?" Elara nodded. "I don't understand it. That light, it came from nowhere. I've never felt anything like it before." Liran gave her a thoughtful look. "Sounds like the light of Eloria. It's an ancient artifact, said to have the power to banish darkness. Some believe it's not just an object, it's a force that can manifest in people. Maybe that's what's happening to you." Elara frowned. "But why me? I'm no warrior. I've never even held a sword." "Sometimes, strength comes from unexpected places," Liran replied. "You stood up to Malvora. That's more than most people can say." Elara fell silent, her thoughts swirling. She didn't feel strong. She felt scared and uncertain, like a child lost in the dark. But she couldn't deny the power she had felt, the way the light had surged through her. If it truly was the light of Eloria, then maybe there was hope after all. Their journey took them deeper into the forest, toward the border of Lyrian. Liran explained that the kingdom had once been an ally of Valoria, but relations had soured in recent years. Still, he believed they might find help there, or at least information about the light of Eloria. As they walked, Liran began to share more about himself. He had been a soldier in Lyrian's army, part of a secret order tasked with protecting the kingdom from dark forces. But the order had been betrayed from within, and Liran had been captured during a mission to infiltrate Malvora's fortress. He had spent months in the dungeons, planning his escape, until Elara had arrived. "I thought I was done for," Liran admitted. "But then you showed up, and I realized I wasn't alone. You gave me something to fight for." Elara smiled faintly. "I think we gave each other something to fight for." Their path was not without danger. Shadow creatures roamed the forest, drawn to Malvora's dark influence. The first attack came at dusk, as they were setting up camp. A pack of shadow wolves emerged from the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on Elara and Liran. Liran drew his dagger, his movements swift and precise. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Elara obeyed, her heart pounding as she watched Liran fight. He moved like a shadow himself, his strikes quick and deadly. But the wolves were relentless, and their numbers began to overwhelm him. Without thinking, Elara stepped forward, her hands glowing with the same golden light as before. The wolves hesitated, their growls turning to whimpers as the light grew brighter. With a final burst of energy, Elara drove them back, the creatures retreating into the darkness. Liran stared at her, his chest heaving. "You're full of surprises, princess." Elara smiled weakly. "I'm just glad it worked." The encounter left them both shaken, but it also strengthened their resolve. They continued their journey, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Liran taught Elara how to defend herself, showing her how to use a dagger and move quietly through the forest. She was a quick learner, her determination driving her to improve. As they neared the border of Lyrian, they encountered a group of travelers, a ragtag band of survivors who had fled their homes to escape Malvora's forces. Among them was a woman named Rin, a skilled fighter with a sharp tongue and a mysterious past. She had heard rumors of the light of Eloria and offered to join Elara and Liran on their quest. "I've got nothing left to lose," Rin said, her eyes hard but determined. "If there's a chance to take down Malvora, I'm in." Elara hesitated, unsure if they could trust her. But Liran nodded. "We could use someone with your skills. Welcome to the team." The group continued their journey, their numbers growing as they encountered more survivors. Elara's presence inspired hope, and her connection to the light of Eloria became a beacon for those who had lost everything. But with hope came danger. Malvora's forces were relentless, and the closer they got to Lyrian, the more frequent the attacks became. One night, as they camped in the ruins of an old temple, Elara had another vision. She saw the light of Eloria, glowing brightly in the heart of a mountain. She knew then that their destination was not Lyrian, but the Temple of Dawn, an ancient structure hidden deep in the mountains. When she told Liran and Rin about the vision, they exchanged a glance. "The Temple of Dawn is heavily guarded," Rin said. "Even if we can get past the traps, Malvora's forces will be waiting for us." "We don't have a choice," Elara replied. "If the light of Eloria is there, then that's where we need to go." Liran nodded. "Then we'll find a way. Together." The journey to the Temple of Dawn was fraught with challenges. They faced treacherous terrain, deadly traps, and constant attacks from shadow creatures. But Elara's connection to the light grew stronger with each trial, and her leadership brought the group together. As they reached the base of the mountain, Elara felt a surge of determination. The Temple of Dawn loomed above them, its ancient spires piercing the sky. She knew that the final battle was near, and that the fate of the world rested on their shoulders. "This is it," she said, her voice steady. "No matter what happens, we fight for each other. We fight for the light." Liran and Rin nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. Together, they began the ascent, ready to face whatever awaited them. The Temple of Dawn stood atop the mountain like a sentinel of old, its ancient stone walls weathered by time but still radiating an aura of power. As Alara, Liran, and Rin approached the entrance, they could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. The temple was said to be a place of great magic, a sanctuary for those who sought the light of Eloria. But it was also a place of trials, designed to test the worthiness of those who dared to enter. The massive stone doors were sealed shut, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as they looked at them. Alara stepped forward, her hand brushing against the cold stone. As she did, the carvings began to glow, and the doors slowly creaked open, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. "Stay close," Liran said, his voice low. "We don't know what's waiting for us in there." The group stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of incense and ancient dust. The temple was vast, its high ceiling supported by towering columns adorned with glowing runes. The floor was made of polished stone, reflecting the faint light that filtered through cracks in the walls. At the far end of the hall stood a massive altar, upon which rested a glowing orb, the light of Eloria. But between them and the altar were the trials. The first trial was a test of courage. As they approached the center of the hall, the ground beneath them began to shift, and the walls closed in, forming a narrow pathway. Shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their forms shifting and twisting as they advanced. Alara felt a surge of fear, but she forced herself to stand firm. "They're illusions," Liran said, his voice calm. "Don't let them get to you." Alara nodded, taking a deep breath. She stepped forward, her hands glowing with the golden light. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. The pathway opened up, and the group pressed on. The second trial was a test of wisdom. They entered a chamber filled with mirrors, each reflecting a different version of themselves. Some showed them as heroes, others as villains. A voice echoed through the room, demanding that they choose the true reflection. Alara hesitated, her mind racing. She looked at the mirrors, each one showing a different aspect of herself, the princess, the leader, the warrior, the frightened girl. But which one was real? "It's not about choosing one," Rin said suddenly. "It's about accepting all of them." Alara turned to her, surprised. Rin's words struck a chord, and she realized the truth. She stepped forward, placing her hand on one of the mirrors. "I am all of these," she said. "And none of them. I am who I choose to be." The mirrors shattered, and the path to the next chamber opened. The third trial was a test of sacrifice. They entered a room filled with treasures, gold, jewels, weapons, and artifacts of immense power. A voice echoed through the chamber, offering them anything they desired in exchange for turning back. Alara felt a pang of temptation, but she shook her head. "We're not here for riches," she said. "We're here for the light." The treasures vanished, and the final door opened, revealing the altar and the glowing orb. But standing between them and the light was Malvora. The sorcerer's presence filled the room, his dark robes swirling around him like a living shadow. His eyes glowed with malice as he regarded them with a cold smile. "You've come far," he said. "But this is where your journey ends." The battle was fierce. Liran and Rin fought valiantly, their weapons clashing against Malvora's dark magic. But the sorcerer was powerful, his attacks relentless. Alara watched in horror as Liran was struck down, his body crumpling to the ground. "No," she screamed, rushing to his side. But Liran's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Malvora turned to her, his hand outstretched. "You cannot win, princess. The darkness will consume you, just as it has consumed everything else." Alara felt a surge of anger and despair, but then she remembered the light. She stood, her hands glowing brighter than ever. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady. The light will always prevail. She raised her hands, and the light of Eloria surged forth, enveloping Malvora in a blinding glow. The sorcerer let out a roar of anger, his form dissolving into shadow. But as the light faded, Elara collapsed to the ground, exhausted. When she woke, she was lying beside the altar, the light of Eloria glowing softly in her hands. Liran and Rin were beside her, their faces filled with relief. "You did it," Liran said, his voice weak but filled with pride. "You defeated him." Elara smiled faintly, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. "We did it," she said. "Together." The journey back from the Temple of Dawn was a somber one. Though they had retrieved the light of Eloria and driven Malvora back, the cost had been high. Liran's injuries were severe, and even with Rin's skill as a healer, it was clear he would need time to recover. Elara carried the light in a small, intricately carved box, its glow a constant reminder of the power they now held, and the responsibility that came with it. As they descended the mountain, the group encountered more survivors, refugees who had fled their homes to escape Malvora's forces. Word of Elara's victory at the temple spread quickly, and soon, a small army began to form around her. Farmers, blacksmiths, soldiers, and even children joined their cause, drawn by the hope that the light of Eloria represented. Elara was overwhelmed by the support, but she also felt the weight of their expectations. She was no longer just a princess, she was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope in a world consumed by darkness. She knew that the final battle was coming, and that the fate of the world rested on her shoulders. Malvora's fortress loomed on the horizon, a dark and foreboding structure that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The shadow creatures were more numerous than ever, their glowing eyes watching from the edges of the forest. But Elara's army was ready. They had trained, they had prepared, and they were willing to fight for the light. The night before the battle, Elara stood at the edge of the camp, staring at the fortress. Liran joined her, his movement still slow and pained but his spirit unbroken. "You've come a long way," he said, his voice soft. "From a princess who didn't know how to hold a sword to the leader of an army." Elara smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you. Without all of you." Liran placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've got this, Elara. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already made a difference." Elara nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll end this. For Valoria. For everyone." The battle began at dawn. Elara's army charged toward the fortress, their cries echoing across the battlefield. The shadow creatures surged forward to meet them, their forms twisting and writhing as they clashed with the defenders. Elara fought at the front, her hands glowing with the light of Eloria as she drove back the darkness. Liran and Rin fought beside her, their weapons flashing in the early morning light. The battle was fierce and chaotic, but Elara's presence inspired her soldiers to fight with everything they had. The tide began to turn, and the shadow creatures started to retreat. But then Malvora appeared. The sorcerer stood atop the fortress walls, his dark robes billowing in the wind. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light as he raised his hands, summoning a storm of dark energy. The ground shook, and the sky turned black as Malvora unleashed his full power. Elara knew this was the moment she had been preparing for. She stepped forward, the light of Eloria glowing brightly in her hands. "This ends now, Malvora," she shouted, her voice carrying across the battlefield. Malvora's laughter was cold and mocking. "You think you can defeat me, princess? You are nothing but a child playing with forces you cannot understand." Elara didn't respond. Instead, she focused on the light, letting its power flow through her. The glow intensified, spreading out in a wave that pushed back the darkness. Malvora's smile faded as the light reached him, his form beginning to waver. "No," he roared, his voice filled with rage and desperation. "This cannot be." But it was too late. The light of Eloria enveloped him, its power overwhelming his dark magic. With a final, ear-splitting scream, Malvora disintegrated into nothingness, his fortress crumbling around him. The battlefield fell silent as the shadow creatures vanished, their forms dissolving into smoke. The sky cleared, and the sun broke through the clouds, its light bathing the land in warmth. Elara stood amidst the ruins, her body trembling with exhaustion but her heart filled with relief. It was over. The survivors cheered, their voices rising in a chorus of joy and triumph. Elara turned to Liran and Rin, who were standing beside her, their faces filled with pride. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Liran smiled. "You did it, Elara. You saved us all." In the days that followed, the survivors began to rebuild. The kingdom of Valoria was in ruins, but its spirit was unbroken. Elara was crowned queen, her coronation a symbol of hope and renewal. She vowed to lead her people with compassion and strength, to ensure that the darkness would never return. Liran and Rin stayed by her side, their loyalty unwavering. Together, they worked to restore the kingdom, their bond stronger than ever. As Elara stood on the balcony of the newly rebuilt palace, looking out at the sunrise, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The light of Eloria rested in a place of honor within the palace, its glow a constant reminder of the power of hope and the strength of the human spirit. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. The darkness had been banished, and the light had prevailed.